Your attention is the most limited and valuable resource you have. That's not just a motivational statement. It's a neuroscientific fact. Your brain is an incredibly powerful system, but it's also selective. It cannot process everything at once. It has to prioritize. The prefrontal cortex, the area of your brain responsible for attention, planning, and decision-making, relies on limited resources to function effectively. Every moment, it's deciding what to tune into and what to tune out. And this means that wherever your attention goes, your energy follows, neuronally, biologically, and even behaviorally. Think of your attention as a spotlight. Wherever you shine that light, you're activating networks in your brain to support that focus. You're also deactivating other networks in the process. This is called attentional gating. It's a real physiological mechanism. When you're deeply focused on something, say, or working on a goal, your brain suppresses irrelevant stimuli so you can stay locked in. But here's the problem. In today's world, that spotlight is constantly being hijacked. Notifications, comparison, endless streams of information. They all compete for your focus. Every time your attention is pulled in a different direction, your brain has to switch tasks. And task switching is costly. Not only does it burn through glucose and oxygen, key metabolic fuels for your brain, it also creates a state of cognitive fatigue. That fatigue doesn't just feel like tiredness. It leads to decreased willpower, slower thinking, and even anxiety. When your attention is fragmented, your nervous system becomes disorganized. The brain's default mode network, often associated with mind wandering and internal dialogue, becomes overactive, especially when your attention is externalized and unfocused. This can lead to rumination, negative self-talk, and feelings of overwhelm. On the flip side, when you train yourself to focus on a single task, especially one that aligns with your goals or values, your brain becomes more coherent. Neural oscillations synchronize, cognitive effort decreases, and you enter states of deep work or flow. In these states, energy is not being leaked. It's being optimized. There's also a deeper psychological and emotional layer to attention. When you focus excessively on others, what they're doing, what they think, how you compare, you are handing over your energy. You are placing power of your emotional state in someone else's hands. That's not a metaphor. Your autonomic nervous system, the system that regulates stress and arousal, is highly responsive to perceived social threat. And in the digital age, social threat doesn't come from real confrontation. It comes from likes, judgments, and comparisons. Every time you dwell on how you measure up to someone else, you're triggering stress responses, spikes in cortisol and adrenaline that consume energy and limit your capacity to perform at your best. When you focus on yourself, you breathe your body, your goals, you regain control. That control begins in the nervous system and radiates outward. Your brain begins to function in a more orderly fashion. Your body relaxes. Your immune system stabilizes. You're not as reactive. And over time, your baseline level of energy increases, not because you're doing more, but because you're managing your most important resource, attention. This is why focusing on yourself is not selfish. It's strategic. It's how you build a life that is resilient, purpose-driven, and biologically sustainable. You can't give energy to others, to your work, or to your mission if your attention is constantly scattered. By learning to control your attention, by protecting it, refining it, and directing it, you're not just improving focus. You're optimizing the entire ecosystem of your body and mind. In the end, every meaningful change in life starts with one choice: what will you pay attention to? Because what you focus on, you feed, and what you feed grows. Your brain is constantly changing. Every experience, every thought, every action you take is reshaping it in real time. This is the core principle of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on where and how you focus your attention. Neuroplasticity isn't passive. It doesn't happen just because time is passing or because you're alive. It happens in response to repeated intentional focus. What you pay attention to determines which neural pathways are strengthened and which ones fade away. This is a biological reality. Your brain is like a living feedback loop, reinforcing what you practice, what you rehearse, and what you repeatedly bring your awareness to. When you focus on yourself, on your habit thoughts, your internal processes, you are actively directing that loop. You are building pathways that make future actions easier. You are laying down the scaffolding for your future behavior. The neurons involved in those focused activities become more efficient. They work together more tightly. Signals move faster. The connection becomes automatic. That's how a thought turns into a pattern, and a pattern turns into identity. And none of this happens by chance. It happens through deliberate, repeated attention. This is why self-focus is so powerful. It's not just about motivation or mindset. It's about biology. Your brain's plasticity is experience dependent, meaning it changes in response to the inputs you give it. So if your input is always outward, consumed by what others are doing, constantly distracted by the external world, then your brain becomes wired for reactivity, not intention. You become a responder to your environment rather than a creator of your environment. Your neurocircuitry adapts to being externally directed. You lose your internal compass. But when you consistently redirect your focus inward, you start to take control of the rewiring process. That control begins with a decision to notice your own patterns, to notice when you procrastinate, when you self-sabotage, when you check out. And instead of judging it, you observe it. Observation is a form of focus. The moment you observe a thought or behavior without reacting, you create space between stimulus and response. And in that space, change becomes possible. That's how awareness leads to transformation. It's not enough to simply want change. You have to place your energy, your mental focus, on the process of change itself. That's when the brain starts allocating resources to support new behaviors. Neuroplasticity is not a motivational phrase. It's a physiological process that relies on repetition, intensity, and relevance. And relevance is personal to the signals you give it. That's why focusing on yourself is essential. You can't rewire your brain with someone else's goal. You need to anchor your focus in something that truly matters to you. Another key to neuroplasticity is emotional engagement. The brain rewires more quickly when there's emotional salience. When you focus on your own growth, on overcoming your own challenges, the emotional stakes are higher. You care more. And that emotional charge fuels deeper learning and longer lasting change. It's why journaling, meditation, therapy, focus training, any form of deep personal work creates such a strong imprint in the brain because it's not just cognitive, it's embodied. The mistake many people make is waiting to feel ready, but readiness doesn't come before focus. Focus builds readiness. The more you direct your attention inward, the more capable you become of rewiring the systems that hold you back. It's like working a muscle. Each rep strengthens the pathway. This is the core of transformation. It's not just about setting goals or visualizing outcomes. It's about focusing your attention in such a consistent, deliberate way that your brain begins to reflect the change you're pursuing. The focus becomes the practice becomes the identity. And over time, without needing willpower in every moment, you become the person you intended to be. Not by chance, but by design. Dopamine is often misunderstood. People think of it as the reward chemical, something that floods your brain when you achieve something big or exciting. But the reality is more nuanced and more empowering. Dopamine is not about the reward itself. It's about movement toward the reward. It's the neuromodulator of motivation, drive, and forward action. And the most interesting part, you have control over how it gets released, depending on where you place your focus. The dopamine system is deeply tied to the concept of anticipation. When you focus on a goal, especially one that's meaningful to you, your brain begins releasing dopamine not at the finish line, but during the process of pursuit. This chemical surge gives you energy, focus, and the sense that you're progressing. It creates a forward-leaning posture in both your mind and body. This is why focusing on yourself, on your own path, your own process, is essential It's how you tap into an intrinsic dopamine system that's sustainable over the long term. When you focus externally on what others are doing, achieving, or projecting, you engage in a dangerous feedback loop. You start tying your dopamine to external validation, like a compliment, an outcome that someone else sets. That feels good in the short term, but it's volatile and fragile. Why? Because it puts your internal chemistry in someone else's hands. Now your energy and motivation depend on approval or recognition that's out of your control. Compare that to a process where your focus is inward, where you reward yourself for the outcome, but for showing up, for doing the work, for getting one step closer. When you shift your attention to the EBE process, you train your brain to release dopamine in response to effort, not just achievement. This is a critical difference because outcomes are rare, often unpredictable, and sometimes anticlimactic. But effort, that's something you can repeat every single day. When you learn to link dopamine to effort, you become almost limitless in your capacity to take action. There's also a biological explanation for this. The brain has a circuit called the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. It connects deep motivational centers in the brainstem to areas like the nucleus accumbens and the prefrontal cortex, regions involved in planning and reward tracking. This circuit is active when you're pursuing something with focus, but it becomes dysfunctional when you focus too much on the endpoint, or worse, on external comparison. You overload it with expectation and create a system that's prone to burnout, disappointment, or constant restlessness. By contrast, when you focus on yourself and reinforce small wins, checking off a task, learning something new, sticking to a habit, you train that same circuit to respond to internal milestones. Your brain becomes your ally in pursuit, not just your judge after results. And over time, that leads to sustained motivation, increased energy, and a sense of confidence that isn't dependent on external outcomes. This isn't just psychological. It's biochemical. When you set a goal and make incremental progress toward it, your dopamine system creates a natural feedback loop that supports neuroplasticity. In other words, the pursuit of the goal doesn't just feel good, it literally changes your brain. New pathways are strengthened. Habits are encoded. Identity starts to shift. But all of that is only possible when your attention stays on your own process. One of the most empowering things you can do is learn to self-generate dopamine, not through hacks or shortcuts, but through focused effort and internal reward. When you say to yourself, "I'm proud of how I showed up today," or "that was hard, but I stayed with it," you're reinforcing the kind of motivation that lasts. You're not chasing highs, you're building resilience. In the end, the message is simple but powerful: focus on your path. Focus on your process. Link your sense of reward to effort, not to comparison or outcomes. Because when you do, your brain becomes a source of sustainable energy, and your goals become inevitable, not because they're easy, but because you're neurologically aligned with the pursuit. Stress is not inherently bad. In fact, it's a biological necessity. Without stress, we wouldn't grow, adapt, or survive. The key distinction is not whether you experience stress. It's whether that stress is managed and directed or left chaotic and unmanaged. Most people think of stress as the enemy, something to be avoided or eliminated. But in reality, stress is a form of energy. It's your body's way of mobilizing resources to deal with challenge, pressure, or change. The real problem isn't stress itself. It's mismanaged energy. When you encounter a stressful situation, your body activates a series of physiological responses: increased heart rate, heightened alertness, faster breathing, and the release of hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. This response is designed to help you act, to move, to focus, but in a world where most stress is psychological, not physical, those signals often go unused. Instead of taking action, we ruminate, we freeze, we scroll. The stress response doesn't get discharged, and over time, that energy builds up. It leads to burnout, anxiety, and exhaustion, not because the body is broken, but because the energy was never directed where it was meant to go. This is where focus becomes essential. When you focus on yourself, on a task, a goal, or a deliberate practice. You give your stress a purpose. You channel the energy instead of letting it spiral. That's how adaptation happens. In biology, the stress recovery adaptation cycle is how all growth occurs. You introduce a challenge stress, then you recover from it. And finally, your system adapts and becomes stronger. But that cycle only completes when the stress is structured, when it's aimed at something meaningful. If your stress comes from constant comparison, from worrying about what others think, from chasing expectations that aren't your own, then your nervous system is in a state of chronic activation. That's different from acute, purposeful stress. Chronic stress keeps your system on high alert with no clear endpoint. It depletes your immune system, disrupts sleep, impairs cognition, and damages your long-term energy reserves. And again, it's not the intensity of the stress, it's the directionlessness of it. It's the lack of control. By focusing on yourself, you regain that control. You're not eliminating stress, you're transforming it. You begin to see challenge as something you can move through rather than something that defines you. This shift in focus changes your physiology. Studies have shown when people perceive stress as something that serves a purpose, as a signal to prepare rather than a threat, they actually have better outcomes. Their blood pressure stabilizes more quickly, their hormone levels balance faster, and their performance improves. There's also a cognitive layer to this. When you focus outward during stress, blaming others, fixating on problems, or getting caught in the loop of, why me? Your prefrontal cortex, the brain's decision-making center, becomes less effective. Your ability to plan, regulate emotions, and stay on task declines. But when you focus inward, what can I control right now? What's the next step? You engage the prefrontal cortex and restore order to the nervous system. This isn't about avoiding discomfort. Growth requires discomfort. What matters is whether the discomfort is constructive. When you give your energy direction by focusing on your actions, your breathing, your habits, you turn stress into fuel. Your brain starts to associate challenge with progress rather than panic. Over time, this builds what's known as stress resilience, the ability to face hard things and recover faster, not because you're tougher, but because you've trained your system to respond, not react. Ultimately, stress becomes a tool. It becomes a signal, not a sentence. And the quality of your life doesn't depend on avoiding stress. It depends on how skillfully you manage your energy under pressure. That begins with focus. The more you direct your attention inward, the more intelligently your body and brain handle stress. You become less reactive, more adaptable, and infinitely more powerful in how you show up. Energy is not just physical, it's mental, emotional, and neural. The quality of your energy dictates how clearly you think, how well you make decisions, and how consistently you take action. Most people think of energy as something fixed, like a battery that gets used up during the day. But in reality, your energy is more like a dynamic system deeply influenced by your attention, your environment, and your internal state. When you focus on yourself, you begin to take command of that system. You start to notice where your energy goes, and more importantly, where it leaks. Energy leaks are often subtle. They show up as unnecessary worry, overthinking, chronic comparison, or saying yes to things that don't align with your values. Every one of these actions, though small on the surface, consumes neural resources. The brain has a finite supply of metabolic energy, and it burns through it faster when you're operating from a scattered or externally driven state. Focus is the tool that closes these leaks. It acts like a gatekeeper, determining what gets your energy and what doesn't. And when that focus is centered on your own goals, growth, and well-being, you become more efficient, more resilient, and less reactive. A major component of energy management is understanding the link between focus and neural activation. When you're focused on something meaningful, the brain organizes itself around that task. Networks that support learning, memory, and problem solving become active, while irrelevant circuits are quieted. This doesn't just make you more productive, it conserves energy. You're not wasting effort switching between distractions or fighting inner conflict. Instead, your attention is streamlined. This creates a flow state where action feels smooth and time often feels compressed. It's not just a psychological experience, it's a biological optimization of energy. But this kind of focus doesn't happen by accident. It requires deliberate self-regulation. That means getting clear on what matters to you, setting boundaries, and creating environments that support your attention. When you're constantly exposed to noise, whether digital, social, or emotional, you lose coherence. Your thoughts become fragmented. Your nervous system stays on high alert. Over time, this leads to exhaustion, not from doing too much, but from doing too many things that lack alignment. When you bring the focus back to yourself, you simplify, you strip away what's unnecessary. You begin to conserve energy not through inactivity, but through intentionality. Another way energy is preserved is through emotional regulation. When you focus inward, you become more aware of your emotional states. You notice when you're tense, agitated, or drained. That awareness allows you to pause, breathe, and reset, rather than reacting impulsively. Emotions like resentment, jealousy, or self-doubt are not just feelings. They're high-cost energetic states. They tax the nervous system, trigger stress responses, and impair executive function. But when you stay anchored in your own journey, those emotions lose their grip. You're less concerned with what others are doing and more committed to doing your own work well. This doesn't make you selfish. It makes you clear. Clarity is one of the most underrated sources of energy. When you know what you're working toward and why it matters, your brain stops spinning in circles. Decision fatigue goes down. Confidence goes up. That clarity creates a feedback loop. More energy allows for more focus, which reinforces clarity, which generates more energy. It's self-sustaining, but only when your attention is aligned with your values. Managing your energy starts with reclaiming your focus, not just in short bursts, but as a way of living. When you start each day asking, where is my energy best spent today? And answer honestly, you start living with intention. That doesn't mean you avoid hard work or challenges. It means you engage with them on your own terms. You stop leaking energy into things you can't control and start investing it into what you can. In the end, high energy isn't a personality trait. It's a product of aligned focus. The more you center your attention on what's real, what's true, and what's within your influence, the more powerful and grounded your energy becomes. That's not just better for you. It's better for everyone you affect. The ability to create your own reality is not some mystical idea. It's a biological process grounded in how your brain interprets and responds to the world. Your perceptions, beliefs, and habits are not fixed truths. They are dynamic constructs shaped by repeated experiences and focused attention. Every time you focus on something, whether it's a thought, a behavior, or a goal, you reinforce the neural pathways that support it. Over time, these pathways form the lens through which you view reality. What you choose to focus on quite literally becomes your experience of life. Your brain is a prediction machine. It's constantly taking in sensory data and using past experiences to generate models of the world, what to expect, how to feel, how to act. This is how you navigate your environment efficiently. But here's the key: these models aren't objective truths. They're shaped by what you repeatedly attend to. If you consistently focus on problems, failures, or negative comparisons, your brain adapts by building a reality where those elements are central. Your thoughts become more pessimistic, your emotional tone becomes heavier, and your behaviors become more reactive. Not because that's the truth, but because that's the model you've been reinforcing. On the other hand, if you focus on growth, self-awareness, and what's within your control, your brain starts to rewire around those inputs. You become more solution-oriented. You see possibility where you once saw limitation. You act with intention instead of reactivity. This isn't about ignoring reality or pretending everything is positive. It's about directing your attention toward what empowers you, what allows you to respond rather than react. When you do that, you begin to experience a version of reality that reflects your agency, not your fear. There's a term in neuroscience for this: selective attention. It's the process by which your brain filters information based on relevance and priority. What you focus on becomes more neurologically prominent. This means your attention doesn't just reflect your reality, it constructs it. Two people can have the same external experience, but their internal reality will be shaped by what they focus on. One person sees opportunity, the other sees threat. The difference isn't the situation, it's the perception created by attention. This is why focusing on yourself is so critical. When your attention is outward, when it's constantly monitoring what others are doing or thinking, you give away your power to shape your reality. You start living in reaction to external cues. But when your attention is inward, when you focus on your values, your patterns, your direction, you take back the authorship of your experience. You become less influenced by noise and more attuned to your own clarity. That shift has massive implications. It changes how you handle stress, how you interpret setbacks, and how you connect with others. Your beliefs are also shaped by attention. Beliefs are not static, they're reinforced by repetition and emotion. The more you focus on something, the more your brain encodes it as meaningful. That's how limiting beliefs form, not because they're true, but because they've been rehearsed. But the good news is that the same mechanism allows for change. By deliberately focusing on more empowering perspectives and repeating them consistently, you can reshape your belief system. Over time, your brain adjusts its internal narrative to match the new input. That's neuroplasticity in action. This is not about toxic positivity or ignoring challenges. It's about recognizing that your internal state is malleable and that attention is the lever. You can't always control your circumstances, but you can control what you make of them. You can choose what gets your energy, what thoughts get reinforced, and what kind of person you are becoming with each moment of focus. That's the essence of creating your own reality, understanding that your brain is always listening to what you prioritize. And when you focus on yourself, you stop living in a reactive loop and start building a life aligned with who you want to be. In a world filled with distraction and noise, the ability to direct your focus inward, to consciously create your mental and emotional framework, is a form of personal freedom. It's not about control over everything. It's about control over what matters most, your inner world. Because once you own that, your outer world starts to reflect it. Not immediately, not magically, but gradually, neurologically, and sustainably.